unpause the recording to make sure that we get it for those that aren't able to join us today. We are absolutely thrilled to see all of you here today, and especially considering that many districts are just kicking off their school year. In fact, I was at an open house with my kids this very morning. So I hope you've had a smooth start to your academic term. And as some of you have probably experienced, back to school time can be a real whirlwind of activity, from open houses to preparation for a successful year ahead. So we appreciate that you've taken the time to join us today. Before we dive into the webinar, I do want to take a moment to make sure that everything runs seamlessly. First, all of your microphones have been muted to prevent any unwanted background noise. We do encourage you to engage with us throughout the session. We have the chat feature as well as Q&A. Your questions are highly valued, and we'd love to address them during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And finally, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded, and you will have access to the recording for future reference. Today, we're gathering not just as educators, but as dedicated leaders committed to the continuous enhancement of our educational systems. At ABLE, we firmly believe that student-centered scheduling isn't a topic that we can afford to put aside once the school year begins. It's an ongoing journey and a commitment to creating learning environments that genuinely prioritize each student's unique needs and potentials. Over the next 45 minutes, our journey is going to take us a little bit through the strategies and concepts that remain essential, whether you're at the onset of your school year or well into it. We'll explore the key elements that will empower all of you, our esteemed school and district leaders, to ensure that your master schedule aligns seamlessly with your mission of nurturing the best possible student outcomes. Without further ado, it brings me immense pleasure to introduce my colleague and our distinguished speaker today, ABLE's Chief of Staff, Amy Filsinger. Amy is the embodiment of the principles we hold dear here at ABLE. Her expertise in transformative education systems, leadership development, and student-centered scheduling serve as an inspiration to all of us. She is a strong advocate for rethinking current models of education, and she believes that new models must consider design thinking and systems that promote student agency. Amy is a graduate from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service with a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Policy, a certification in international business. She also holds a Master's of Education from American University and is alumna of the Relay GSE's National Principal Fellowship. She lives in San Francisco with her partner, her son, and her pup, who ensures every day is filled with walks up the city's many hills. So Amy, I'm going to let you take us on this journey to explore and empower each other. The virtual stage is yours, and we are eagerly poised to absorb your insights.
Wonderful. Thank you for the wonderful intro. And as always, Gretchen, thank you for matching your background to our presentation. Really just what a wonderful visual experience. So very nice. Everyone, if you are here to have a conversation around 5 proven strategies to unlock the power of student-centered scheduling, you are in the right place. And if you're not, well, I hope to make this engaging enough that it was a happy and serendipitous accident. So we'll see how this goes. This feels extremely timely for me as a former principal, as Gretchen alluded to, when I think about the questions that I received from the community, from staff prior to the run-up to back to school. If not the number one, certainly always in the top 3 was, when do we get the schedule? What updates are there to the schedule? And what I'm excited to talk about today is so many of those questions and inquiries that I received from my team and my community were well-founded, because the schedule controls so much about the lived experience of not just our students, not just our staff, but quite frankly, all of the families that and within the district who are a part of the school and the schedule itself. So I'm very excited to talk about its potential. On the topic of all those questions that I received, however, I think the reason I'm particularly excited to talk about it is generally people were very interested when the schedule was being produced, to learn about their particular schedules, to learn about how it would impact the rhythms of their day, their drop-off, their pickup, when their preps were, all of those good questions. But rarely did people ask me, Amy, tell me about how this schedule versus last year is going to help our students perform. How is this schedule going to help them meet their goals? And that's what we're going to talk about today. The conversations I wish I was able to have back then. So as Gretchen alluded to, I'm the Chief of Staff at ABLE, but the most important role in terms of this conversation that I have played is as a principal. And I first became a principal when I was young, and I had a whole lot of social capital to build. And one of the ways that I did that was by building a schedule that everyone was really excited about. And I was able to generate a lot of change and reform in 1 year through the lens of the schedule. So other colleagues have referred to this as leading through the schedule, and that's what we'll talk about today. So I want to start off with a question, and this is one of my very favorite questions to consider because the bar is continually changing for our students, and it feels like it is also continually changing for all of our educators. So I'd love to open this up to the room. Feel free to just type in the chat, what does meaningful graduation mean to you in 2023? We'll spend about 30 seconds here as folks think about this very big question. And as a reminder, I mentioned my experience as a teacher. I didn't, or as an educator, as principal, but I think for many years prior to that, I was a teacher. And so wait time is not a foreign strategy to me. So I'll give you a little bit more, and then just for the sake of time, we'll move on. All right. I am going to jump in and share about what meaningful graduation means to me, and then talk about why this is the question that I start with today. So when I think about meaningful graduation, it's pretty simple. It is that students are not prepared for graduation. They're prepared for every day that is after. And by prepared, what I mean is that they have multiple options in high growth, high wage industries and a path to them. Which the reason why I qualified this with 2023, as we know, is only getting increasingly more challenging as the skills gap ever widens for our students. The reason why I talk about meaningful graduation and not graduation is that we are talking about student-centered learning. And when I talk about student-centered learning and the equity that should undergird it and support it, what we should all be thinking about and asking ourselves about is equitable for what reason? And student-centered for what reason? Well, student-centered is all well and good, but if we're just talking about students getting what they want, or students getting to play an explicit part of building the schedule, getting to maybe start a little bit later than the year prior, then that's not really the question that we're trying to answer here. When I'm talking about student-centered, I specifically mean student-centered in the sense of it is supporting a meaningful graduation. And there are 5 strategies that we're going to go over that will take a scheduling process and transform it from something that is more teacher-centric to something that is more student-centric, again, with the goal of improving overall college and career outcomes for students. So strategy number 1 that we're going to talk about is collaboration and interaction. And this is actually not just related to adults. This is related to students just as much. We'll use a few examples of when you are shaping the schedule, the various ways you should be considering the collaboration and the interaction of not just your staff, but also your students across the school day. Strategy number 2 is sorting versus supporting. I think we all know that schedules were built to out of necessity in order to promote a factory-based model of education, right? How do I take this immensely challenging math problem of schedules? I have 3,000 students, I got 6-7 slots in my day, and I have 200 teachers. How do I make that all magically work? It's extremely hard. And so it makes sense that the scheduling process and scheduling tools were developed in order to sort students and to make that really Herculean task accessible. But there is a paradigm shift to being able to support students through scheduling instead, and we'll talk about that today. Strategy number 3 is around constraints and preferences. This is one of the places that I like to start my conversations when I start working with school districts and school leaders on their scheduling questions. As we will discuss, every single time you get into a schedule and start talking about moving things around to maximize results for students, there are those sacred cows or courses that you can't touch or preps that you can't touch. And there is a really distinct difference between a true constraint and a preference that I think adults need to be enabled to have really challenging and critical conversations about. Strategy number 4, structured choice versus choice. So at the end of the day, scheduling is a math problem. And something that we say a lot at ABLE is that choice can be the enemy of equity. The more options that I have, the more pathways that students can take, the harder it is to ensure that each one of those pathways is equally valuable and leads to an equally high quality outcome for students. And I'll talk and visualize some of those options for you. And then finally, adult alignment. In order to make something super student-centered, making sure that all adults are aligned and on the same page around what it is you are trying to accomplish for students is, of course, the most critical place to start. And this one I love because educators are so good at doing this. We have data-drivenness written into our DNA. This is a skill that we have all honed over the course of the past 20, 30 years. Since a nation at risk even. And I think the ability to apply this data-drivenness to the schedule and our scheduling processes and rally around what our priorities are is a really exciting untapped opportunity. So let's start going into strategy number 1. Scheduling, as we know, determines the individual students and staff that interact with one another every single day. So in many schools, this actually amounts to over 10,000 minutes over the course of the year. This has a huge influence on the teacher and student experience. And we know that an equity-driven best practices ensure that we pay attention using rich analytics on the details of this interactions. And I can't overstate this enough. When people think about scheduling, you think about trying to make sure that holes are filled in a teacher's day and a student's day. But what you are really doing is deciding who is taught by whom and what those students are exposed to. And we know time and time again, academic literature has taught us that there are 2 key levers in terms of changing outcomes for students. And one is teacher efficacy, and the other is the content that students are exposed to. So at the end of the day, it is the scheduling process that determines those 2 most powerful levers. And it is why that as a school leader, it is not a task that I can afford to hand off to someone else on my team. It is something that I really have the opportunity and quite frankly, the obligation to pay attention to if I have student outcomes that I'm trying to reach. And I would say the same applies at the district level. So here's an example, and I'm going to give you quite a few when it comes to the strategy of various ways that we can be thinking about monitoring this as we build our schedules. So generally, when I start working with districts and school leaders, we are developing protocols to look at this data across various schedules in the school district system on some sort of a cadence. Maybe it's a monthly cadence, and then when scheduling really picks up, this might be as frequently as an actual week. And this is an example, of course, of a place that you might want to start. This is the most, I would say, accessible, starting by locking in common planning time across grade level teams. So one is just beginning to interrogate who is collaborating with whom. Do you have departmental collaboration? That's great. Another thing that we know that is that for teachers to actually talk about the same students and strategize about various ways to support them, both in terms of cross-functional projects and cross-cutting skills, it is really critical to also make sure that those teachers, and whether it's in grade level teams or some other academy type organization, have time to meet with one another, look at those students' data, and actually reflect on it. And so in scheduling systems, I always encourage people to make sure that they are looking for systems where you can lock in common planning time such that if it is moved for one teacher, it moves for all of those teachers, and it is a constraint that is held from the beginning. Some more robust examples that I really like to spend a lot of time on, particularly when we are working on applying a more robust equity lens into the scheduling process, is asking the question of who is teaching who. So this is real data that we actually used with a school district that realized that they had a very segregated school day. They were running an IB program, and this was a very diverse school, and they realized their IB courses were not diverse at all. And this is data that they actually brought to a parent meeting to families of students in the IB program to talk about why things were going to need to change in the schedule. So there are two columns here: teachers who have advanced courses and teachers that do not have advanced courses. And you will see that it is actually broken up, not just by the number of students each of those teachers teach, but also the demographic breakdown. And you'll see that on the left here, for the teachers who have advanced courses, you see far fewer students who are Hispanic and African American, and far more students who are white and Asian. This is in contrast with the teachers on the left, or on the right rather, who have far more students who are Hispanic and African American, and far fewer who are white and Asian. If I am a principal and it is my responsibility to make sure all of my teachers are prepared to support the community, and the lived reality is that those teachers actually teach and support very different communities, then it is going to be extremely challenging to make sure that I am allocating my resources appropriately and making sure that all of those students are taught by the teachers who are going to equip them best to succeed. This is another way of looking at very similar data. And this is, I think, particularly interesting to me as a former coach of teachers and staff who were IEP specialists. There is an immense amount of overhead in making sure that you are appropriately differentiating for both English learners and for students with IEPs. And one thing that we see time and time again is that no one is actually interrogating across teachers in one department or one grade level what percentage of their overall population happens to be students with IEPs or students who are English learners. Just in terms of the time that you might spend going to IEP meetings, but certainly in terms of differentiating materials, it is a very different experience when it comes to that teacher load. And so interrogating, do all my new teachers actually have more overhead than teachers who have more experience under their belt, is a really critical step that I often see missed in the scheduling process. So I want to shift away a bit from looking at teacher collaboration and interaction and looking at student interaction, because this is something that is rarely considered, but I think it can be an extremely powerful measurement of the student experience. We know that students are one another's best teachers, that at this grade level, we actually tend to learn best from our peers. And we talk a lot about this concept of tracking. And so as we were developing analytics for folks who were building out schedules and at the district level, we wanted to start conversations and facilitate conversations around how the student experience differed in terms of who was interacting with whom. This is an example from an actual school district with, of course, specific information removed. And we asked the question around, at each of your high schools, how many distinct students each of your student shares at least one course? And we broke that up across grade levels. So if I were to contrast, I'm actually just going to look at the two schools that were both comprehensive high schools. So we'll look at Jefferson as well, but it was a little bit smaller. But Kennedy and Washington, very similar sizes. But you'll see that at Kennedy, if I'm just contrasting, let's say the ninth graders, 224 is the average amount of discrete individual students that a ninth grader at Kennedy would interact with versus at Washington. Now in ninth grade, which we know is really critical in terms of intervention and making sure students are appropriately supported, this is a really distinct experience. I could make a case for interaction with more students being more powerful. I could make a strong case for interaction with fewer students being more powerful. This is truly data that is just intended to spark a conversation around what the intent is and whether this amount of variation is productive. Perhaps however, where it becomes a bit less opaque in terms of the actions I might take would be where I can break up and display this information very similarly, but instead of by grade level, look at it by ethnicity. So here I'm looking at grade levels. This is actually within one school, and trying to understand for the different student groups by race and ethnicity in my group, what number of students do they interact with? And you can see if I were to contrast two groups, perhaps the dark blue is our Asian students and the purple would be our Black or African American students, I see a really dramatic difference. So let's say starting in 9th grade again, if I'm an Asian student, I interact with 190 students on average. And if I am a Black or African American student, that is 132. Again, who is to say? I could make a case either way for which one of these is perhaps the better student experience to have. But the fact that there is such a stark difference is absolutely a need for conversation, particularly as we see over time that difference tends to dissipate a little bit. And a lot of that is really driven by variation in dropout rates, unfortunately. So I want to pause here for a moment because we just looked at a lot of data, and I would love to hear from this group. Which of these aspects of student and staff interaction do you currently analyze? So we talked about vertical and horizontal teacher prep, the number of students each teacher supports, and thank you, Gretchen, is starting a poll here, the demographics of students each teacher supports, and the peers students interact with during the school day. And you can select all that apply. I'll give everyone about 30 seconds for this. Okay, Gretchen, I'll have you close the poll in about 10 seconds and we will move on. Awesome. Okay, so I want to pivot us into strategy 2, structural changes, a foundation for student outcomes. So as we've discussed and alluded to a little bit, the traditional school schedule is based on the factory model of education. So that means that it is designed to sort students and not to support them. And what I want to make super clear here is that it has been proven out time and time again. And trust me, there are innumerable academic studies who have tried to find different answers to this question, but it is very clear that there is no schedule type that is a silver bullet. This all depends on what your particular goals are and whether the school leader, the district, whomever is implementing this has the vision and the wherewithal and, quite frankly, the dedication to make sure that the staff and community is appropriately supported and trained through that particular adoption of the new schedule. So a block schedule can be absolutely wonderful if the entire structure of the day, teaching approach, et cetera, is not then altered along with it, then it will not be the solution that people are looking for. And I could say this for any type of schedule. During the pandemic, this was a big focus that we were guiding a lot of our partner school districts and school leaders through. What are different schedule types that we can adopt to navigate this extremely difficult challenge? And the wonderful thing about it is that, you know, we did not waste a crisis, as the phrase goes, and we were able to unlock a lot more creativity than perhaps we might be open to in less challenging times. However, then once we, of course, went back to more in-school days, that opportunity to double down on the training and the lessons learned becomes very challenging to make time for. So that is a few examples that I want to make sure that we run through today. So when I'm talking about sorting students, I'm talking about a traditional comprehensive high school site, which there's certainly nothing wrong with a comprehensive high school, but that is what it was designed to do. And it is all about how it is implemented. This might be a traditional 6-period day. This might be a traditional 7:25 start time, prep periods balanced across the school, vertical 9 to 12 department teams. Again, discreetly, none of these things are inherently wrong. It is all about how they are implemented. So then if I want to give examples of ways that I could shift to these potentially to supporting students within a comprehensive high school, how do I make sure that perhaps I create the academies or smaller school models that we know have so much rigor around making sure that all students have access to content that will help them be successful? How do I make sure that teachers can be helpful within successful within that system? Shifting perhaps from a traditional 6-period day to something like a 4x4 hybrid. But again, really making sure that as I make those shifts, I am ensuring that I am leveraging it for what is intended to be leveraged for, deeper learning opportunities and training staff up on that, making sure that credit recovery is a really critical part of that overall strategy. And that if I do have some classes that do need to be taught annually as opposed to on a semester basis, that I'm designing the schedule in a way that supports that. An 8:45 a.m. start time. This is perhaps the only one that is less ambiguous in terms of there is a lot of data that supports that we know that this is something that tends to help students, particularly the older they are in the K-12 spectrum. Common prep periods by grade level, which we've already discussed to some extent, and then grade level integrated teams. Another example of how I like to think really creatively, and this is pulled from a group that does really great thinking around scheduling, District Management Group. And they here have this model of thinking through data-driven scheduling decisions. So if I am altering my schedule, again, this could all be within the confines, as it is here, of a traditional 6-period day. So how do I make this work for me? I know that math is a priority based on my data, or that's something I've decided as a school leader team. So I'm going to actually develop a schedule where wherever math was before, I'm going to make sure that it is first. Maybe not, of course, this wouldn't be possible for every single math course, but for my courses where students tend to struggle the most, my algebra 1s, in some cases my geometries, maybe my sciences that are more math heavy, such as chemistry or physics, those are going to be in the beginning of the day. And then I'm going to be making sure that I have time throughout the day or at the end of the day to potentially provide some math support. Nothing about the structure of the day is actually changing, but I'm building it in such a way that I am supporting the actual student needs that the data are pointing out for me. The next visual that I'm going to show you is going to look a little overwhelming, but there is a lot of potential here because what it does is it actually visualize how students flow throughout the course of their day. So this is a real high school. These are actual students. And basically, the thicker the gray band is, the more students are represented. So over on the left here, I can see the full representation of my 9th grade students, and the thicker bands represent their cohorts. This was a school actually where their cohorts were extremely rigid, and yet there still is some variation built into the day. One of the reasons why we were developing this sort of cohort model for them is because there were only 3 distinct pathways through the day. All of the teachers and all the staff that supported these 9th grade students were accountable for making sure that 3 pathways were as high quality as they possibly could be throughout the day. They were not accounting for every single variation when it came to curriculum, et cetera. And that was a real strength. However, this is actually the same high school, but for 11th grade. And so you can see all of that work around the cohorting becomes very challenging to maintain the more electives and the more pathways that are introduced to the system. So I can't even count the number, nor am I going to try to, the number of variations that are possible. If I am a school leader whose responsibility is to understand what the best possible pathways are for each of my students, this becomes, I would say, untenable to actually manage and analyze and understand if I am trying to account for this amount of variation. So I'm going to pause again and we'll just reopen this poll up. I'd love to hear from folks if you have any thoughts on which support maybe has worked best for your community or communities you've encountered in the past. Double blocking challenging coursework, in-day tutoring, cocooning, intentional staffing, start time adjustments, or other. Cocooning was one I did not mention here, but it was a little bit alluded to in the cohorting. This is an intentional grouping of student groups who maybe have some type of affinity, especially when they are being exposed to new or more rigorous content than they would have before. And I'll give everyone about 10 more seconds, and then we will go on to make sure that we stick to our time. Oh, great. All right. So we have a few answers. I've seen in-day tutoring, which does not surprise me, cocooning, and then intentional staffing. In-day tutoring is actually, I think, a pretty exciting one. The emerging literature on the impact of, in particular, when it comes to math, building in the tutoring during the day is just unquestionable. If you have not read the literature that University of Chicago has just produced on that, I highly, highly recommend it. And perhaps it's something we could send out with this presentation if folks are interested. Intentional staffing, I think, is also just a really powerful one that obviously, based on the first strategy that I shared, I feel very passionate about making sure that we are constantly interrogating and understanding which adults are grouped with which students and setting everyone up for success. All right, thank you, Gretchen. Strategy 3, constraints versus preferences. So this is a fun one because it is in some ways the simplest, right? It just requires conversations, right? This is not necessarily something that requires a lot of professional development. This is not something that requires us changing how the curriculum that we teach our students with or how we support them as they go throughout their day. This doesn't require changing things like transportation or bell schedules or communicating differently to the parents and families that support our students. This is just about taking a really good hard look at how we've made our schedules and the things that we have put upon ourselves as constraints, and asking hard questions about whether they are true constraints or actual preferences. So I alluded to, I have had the opportunity to work with many school districts and schools across the country on their schedules. So we're going to play a little two truths and a lie. These are an example of 3 actual, well, 2 of them are, of constraints that were presented to me as I was helping folks build schedules. 1, teacher X always got period 1 off because his local Starbucks was chronically slow. Teacher Y needed a prep period adjacent to lunch to accommodate regular salon appointments. And teacher Z got the last period prep so they could coach their child's little league at another school. 2 of these things are true and tough conversations we had to have, although these are not the toughest conversations I've had to have. These ones are relatively easier, and one of them is a lie. So I'd love to hear, I don't think people need a whole lot of time, Gretchen. So as soon as we get maybe even one answer, we can shut that poll down. Oh, good. Okay. So, so folks thought it was maybe the 3 folks thought it was the Starbucks answer, and some folks thought it was the second one, the salon answer. Whomever selected the salon answer, you were correct. That is the lie. The Starbucks one is absolutely true. And I don't know, I guess, it's very hard to teach students, of course, when we're low on caffeine. And the teacher and staff recruitment is a very challenging thing right now. So I fully appreciate, when I took over as a principal, my school had 50% attrition annually on average for our staff. You want to keep your teachers happy, especially in a time like this when staffing is really a challenging thing. But I certainly found that a far more powerful way of actually engaging teachers and having them feel satisfied with the schedule was to involve them in the conversations about what we were trying to accomplish and why. So on that, this is where I would say I tend to see the most mistakes being made, or maybe the most frequent mistake, because it is a mistake that is disguised as the very best intention from school and district leaders. And I'm sure everyone on this call has seen a schedule that looks a little bit like this. I do a lot of work as a school leader. I certainly made a version of this when I was a principal to say, here are my teacher lines. Here's how I think the day should go. I spend a lot of time trying to really put everything in exactly the right place. And then I hand it off to someone else and say, all right, put this in the system. press the magic button, and we're going to see what percentages we get at the end of the scheduling process. And I'm using language that is more consistent perhaps with a secondary experience, but it's a very similar process for elementary in terms of that handoff from when I say the schedule is designed to it actually being completed. Because what happens is that when I actually put real numbers in, a lot gets lost. And when I run a schedule based on something like this, even if I get a seemingly extremely high number, 90% or something like that of the course requests are satisfied, the percent that people are not looking at, because it's hard to look at, most scheduling systems do not allow it. This is why we built a scheduling system that could, is that if I don't know the percentage of students who have complete schedules, then I don't actually know how much is going to need to be undone and rebuilt by counselors before the school day actually starts. So counselors, of course, care most about the number of holes they have to fill when they're building a schedule. And I have seen time and time again, schools have 95% of their course requests satisfied and perhaps only 50% of their students with actual complete schedules, which means that every single one of those holes have to be hand filled, which means that all of the good intent that I had in building this eventually needs to be undone. Students are going to be shifted around, sections are going to need to be shifted around in order to actually make things work. So I don't think the mistake is building something like this. I think this can be an immensely powerful conversation tool about why you're putting something in a certain place and why you're not putting something in another place. However, it is really important that the school leader stays involved as the scheduler is being built, such that once sections have to be adjusted and moved around, they can still go back to the original goals and adjust and make those hard calls accordingly. So this is where we always start in the beginning of our work with schools and school districts, is thinking through what is an actual hard constraint and needs to be baked in a visual like what we just saw, and what are preferences and things that are really, really important in most cases, right? I opened with some silly examples, but a lot of times these are good preferences. But at the end of the day, they are things that can be adjusted. So I don't actually think, Gretchen, we need to open a poll for this one, so we'll pause on that. But I do want to share these 3 examples. The science teacher needs courses grouped to accommodate lab prep. English, your highest performing department, needs a common prep. And the band teacher needs a final period prep to get ready for away games. None of these things are constraints, although generally when I present them in trainings, they often are perceived in that way. Each one of these things are preferences. And that's not to say these are not things that I'm going to try my absolute best to make happen for my staff. But when these things come up against, and they do every time, students getting what they want and what they need, I'm going to make a choice based on maximizing student outcomes every single time. And I'm going to make sure that I communicate the why back to the staff. And it is that feedback loop that I think that really is even more important than folks who feel like every one of their preferences have been met. So 2 more strategies. We're going to talk briefly now about structured choice versus choice. We alluded to this a moment ago when I was showing the flow chart of students traveling through cohorts. Every pathway provided to a student should lead to a meaningful graduation. So a lot of times this means the way that I can get there is by painstakingly going into my course catalog and removing every single off-ramp or option that does not lead to students being either college or career ready. And I put a very high bar on what I mean by career readiness. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. So this requires, as in contrast to the last one, this requires extensive change management, because you are likely going to need to change what is offered and what is not offered. And we know in this country in particular, people are very tied to the experience of students should be able to have access to a variety of different things and experiment with what is important to them. But within that content experimentation comes at the cost of making sure that every single student has what they need to be successful. That's where we have to start making really hard choices. So this is an example of a school district that we worked with, that certainly I cannot claim any credit for this, that every time they introduced new content, there was an extremely robust pre-planning consideration that had to be done at the district level to introduce it into the system. So what was the data analysis of incoming students and how did this new content support it? Did this at the time, this was mapped to Common Core. So how does this actually support the demands of how students will be assessed? Actual client needs. So by this, they mean the industry that was local to this particular school district. How does this actually support the needs of those clients? Is there a clear on-ramp locally, not just nationally, for each of these student graduates into industries that are both high growth and high wage? And one plans for intervention so how are students who might be below grade level in terms of accessing some of this content, how are they going to be able to access it in the way that students who are on grade level might be able to? Once those 4 demands are met, and once those questions are answered, which again is this rigorous enough for our students? How will this help students succeed on key math and literacy benchmarks? How does this prepare students for a high wage, high growth industry? And how can all students access it? Then and only then was a course able to be added. And even more critically, this is how courses were removed. So I have worked with school districts who have gone through the process and removed as much as 50% from their course catalog. And some of these are very, very large school districts. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of work, but at the end of the day, it becomes much more manageable for school teams across the district to actually support each of the pathways that are generated. So I want to focus and linger a little bit on career pathways and programs specifically. What do we mean by career pathways that are going to be high quality? One, are they in demand? So does this pathway lead to significant job openings now and into the future? And I would say it is really critical that this is regional, given what we know about the barriers to entry for a lot of students once we're talking about something that is national or broader within the state. Are they high wage? And I'm not talking about, of course, the making sure every student can access a wage that puts them in the 1%. I am talking about wages that are going to allow them to actually be able to make rent and to be able to save on top of that and provide a sustainable life. And then finally, opportunities to advance and upskill. So are these particular opportunities going to allow students to move beyond the high school program into an aligned post-secondary program in that field of study, right? The last thing that we want is design CTE pathways that pigeonhole students into given outcomes. We know, of course, that at that age, students do need optionality in terms of various future options. It's hard to know what is going to be best for them at the time. And so making sure that that advancement pathway is clear is critical. I think this is a really critical infographic for everyone to understand. This is from the Bureau of Labor Management. These are jobs by career field and the entry-level required education. There's a little bit of a false dichotomy between college and career readiness. At the end of the day, when you look at fields that are high growth and high wage, almost all of them require an extensive amount of bachelor's or associates. Business and marketing perhaps is the least of these. Certainly we have trades, agricultural, natural resources, and consumer and culinary services. But the pathway to high wage and high growth in all of those industries is extremely, extremely challenging and limited. Whereas these top 5 are associated with most sustainable financial outcomes for students. So this, I think, is a visual that illustrates our why pretty effectively. If I start with 100 ninth graders, and this is just, 100 random ninth graders from across the country, I can expect that of those, again, averaged across all of our different districts, 82 of them might graduate from high school. And that of those students, 13 might be 2-year college enrollees and 37 might be 4-year college enrollees. And then this goes down to 27 students who would actually complete a college credential within 10 years. And I want to contrast this with polling that has been done very recently of students in very large districts. I'll use Seattle as an example that comes to mind. And in that district, 90% of students said that they wanted to actually have the option to go to college. I don't think anyone who starts college doesn't want to complete it. So to see this enormous chasm between the 109th graders who start their journey and the 27 students who actually complete a college credential within 10 years, not within 4 years, and that's any credential, is really sobering when we think about why this work is so important. So I want to end us on our opportunity, which is another example of something that I think actually doesn't require as much change management as a lot of the other things that we've talked about, and is a really, certainly was for me personally, a really awesome opportunity for folks who might be newer school leaders or newer district leaders to gain a lot of capital. And that is bringing multiple stakeholders into the process of building a student-centered schedule together. If you as a school leader know exactly, or as a district leader know exactly what aspect of the strategic plan you are trying to operationalize, or what student target you are trying to impact, or what student group you are trying to benefit, that's wonderful. That is step one. It doesn't mean a whole lot unless every single person who is living and breathing that schedule every day shares that intent with you and understands your intent. And even better if you bring them along on the journey with you. One of the most powerful school leaders that I've had the opportunity to work with over the course of my co-scheduling career with them, this is a person who at the beginning of scheduling season would publish a memo on their goals for the schedule. And this was after they held an open-ended discussion with the school team and with the school community about it. And then at the end of the process, when the schedule was finalized, they talked about all of the trade-offs they had to make and made it extremely clear the goals they didn't meet and why they had to not meet a preference that everyone wanted, or why they were able to accomplish something that they thought they couldn't accomplish. And the staff was incredibly bought in because even though there was some frustration around preference that hadn't been met, they understood why, and they were all rallied around the student outcomes that drove the process. So here's an example of documentation that we have used to help facilitate that conversation for school leader teams. So making sure that after an action plan is developed, that one strategy and opportunity is honed in on. We always talk about not boiling the ocean. We're not building schedules that are going to fix everything for every subject area and for every student group. So being extremely ruthless when it comes to prioritization. This year, what do we think we can do? And what are all the good things that we can't do? And what are we going to say about all the good things that we can't do, that we wish we could do? And it is more important that one thing is successful than that everything is successful. And just as important, who's on the scheduling team? A schedule built in isolation is not going to be a very popular schedule and not going to be a very effective schedule. It is a lonely, hard task. So one of the first things I always encourage people to do is decide who is the teacher on your staff who's going to be the representative, who is the student on your staff who's going to be the representative, who is the assistant principal, and who is the district leader who has to be a part of the conversation so they can help understand why you're making the choices that you are and how it connects back to the strategic plan. So this last question is open-ended. I would love to hear from folks and go back to why we started this conversation. All of these are strategies, and these are, some of the top 5, but goodness knows if we had another few hours, scheduling is extremely deep. We could talk about 20 more very easily. So these are 5 that I think are paradigm shifts to support meaningful graduation. Which strategy resonated the most with you, and why is that? I would love to hear from the group. And I think for this, feel free to just enter anything into the chat. And if we, and maybe at this time, I think actually the best move is we wanted to make sure that we had time as well for Q&A. So if you either want to answer this question, or if you have a question that you'd like me to field in our last moments together, then I'd love to see either of those. Oh, and thank you, Gretchen, for starting the poll. So as I said, go ahead and answer the poll, or I'd love to hear any questions.
I am just sharing the poll so people can remember if they needed their memories jogged for what the 5 strategies titles were or how we characterize them. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think we can close the poll, Gretchen. So then I think all that remains is that if there are any questions, I can certainly stick around for a few minutes, but most importantly, I just want to thank everyone for doing the work of showing up today. I know that this is a very dense topic, and this is, again, as a former school leader, I cannot think of a busier season in my life. So I know everyone on this call is probably in some way connected to education and supporting that work. So thank you for all that you do. And I really hope that your back to school time has gone really well. So for those of you who need to go, that's my last message. I did see a question around districts evolving, so I want to take that one. How do you see districts evolving in the strategic scheduling work year over year? I love this question, and it relates to what I was just talking about making sure that you are building scheduling plans that do not boil the ocean. If I am a district leader, you can imagine that this question of trying to do a lot of things simultaneously is only magnified when I have every consideration that a district has and more. So I always start with my strategic plan. Let's go to your strategic plan, identify for the however long, 5 years, 10 years, the plan is supposed to drive you. What could you potentially, which particular metrics that you're tracking, does scheduling play a role in? And this is where I would explicitly add those targets into the strategic plan and actually spiral them out over time. So if I were, for example, focusing on something around college and career readiness or equitable or effective resource allocation, to really, really good opportunities for scheduling, I wouldn't actually start by talking about the courses that students take or my budget models. I would actually start with something pretty mundane like data models and making sure that before I analyze any data, that I am establishing norms for how courses are coded, for how teachers are entered, for how inactive resources are removed from the system and are not. And I might just prioritize that in year one, making sure that all the data that I have about scheduling to analyze as a district leader is clean and there are clear protocols. In year two, I'm going to ratchet that up a little bit and take a look at my course catalog and decide that, all right, now that we know that we understand how students are enrolling in these courses across the district, and we know where they're having success and where they're not, and most importantly, we know where we need to improve with student outcomes, what are the courses that need to be cut, and what are the courses that need to be added? And those are two examples, but providing yourself a spiraled plan as a district that is aligned to your strategic goals and explicitly mentions scheduling is absolutely step number one. Okay, what do you think, Gretchen? I think it might be a good time to wrap up and just once again reiterate that we're so grateful for everyone's time today.
yeah, absolutely. We really appreciate the active participation and engagement through the session. We also want to thank you, Amy, for sharing your invaluable expertise. As mentioned before, we will share both the recording as well as today's presentation materials and the reference that Amy made to the in-day tutoring research, so you can review that as well. And we appreciate your time and best of luck this school year.
Thanks, everyone.